by just basically praying and saying, you know what, guys, I just pray that you get a revelation of this. And I would encourage you to, and I speak to myself in this, that we just, again, if we think that somehow we can do Bible study, that we can understand this, we can catch this any way other than prayerfully, we don't understand it the same way Paul did. Because Paul understood even in the writing of the text, even as he's writing this, I need to pray for you guys. This is my prayer for you. I want you to know what my prayer for you is. So we must study this Bible prayerfully. We got to study his word prayerfully. All right, before we move now into chapter 4 of Ephesians, I want to just kind of move over to Colossians for a second, okay? And I want us to see the same idea in Colossians. So we've looked at Ephesians 1 to 3. It's all about what God has done, right? Same thing that we saw in Galatians. Galatians is what God has done. He's justified us apart from works of the law. Romans, which we'll look at tomorrow, Romans is what God has done. He's justified us apart from works of the law. Colossians also talks about what God has done. This is Paul's focus. His focus is what God has done. He's never lost the wonder of salvation. He's never moved away from it. He didn't get mature enough to go, yeah, it was great when I got saved, but now I'm really mature now. He never moved away from the cross, right? And in Colossians in particular, okay, Ephesians, I gave us some background on that earlier. Colossians, what it looks like in particular, the background or the context, you guys for your homework or whatever, the context for this book, for Colossians, is that there were different kinds of teaching coming in. And it was all for the sense, again, this same idea, leaning, what do I need to do? You need to do this, you need to do that in order to be right with God. And one of the key words that will be used in Colossians is this word qualified. Now, I don't know, I didn't check, probably should have. Let me does your Bible in verse 12 of chapter 1, Colossians 1:12, does it have the word qualified? Enabled. Okay. What about chapter 2, verse... Where is it? Chapter 2, verse 18. What does it say in chapter 2, verse 18?
Now all this can come to the Father through the Son and Holy Spirit because of what Christ has done for us.
That's Colossians 2, 18?
No, that's Ephesians.
Okay, Colossians 2. What's Colossians 2:18 say? Does it have disqualify? Does the NLT have disqualify? Chapter 2, verse 18. Condemn you. Okay. All right. The word that's used in chapter 1, chapter 2, it's both qualified, disqualified. It's basically, again, this idea of you're okay now. You're good, right? Don't let anyone disqualify you, make you think that you're not good, right? But particularly what's happening in Colossians is that there's all these different kind of teachings that are coming in, trying to tell the people, you need to do this, you need to do that, if you really want to be right with God. It's the same issue, right? Galatians and Romans, the essence of religion is what must I do to be right with God? That's the essence of religion. And so all these different places, it's always the same thing. And Paul's answer always is, it's what God has done for us. It's receiving what God has done for us. And so look at chapter 2, verse 4. Colossians chapter 2, verse 4. I say this in order that no one may delude you with plausible arguments, for though I'm absent in body, yet I'm with you in spirit. Right? He says, I'm saying this so that no one might kind of confuse you. Okay? Look at chapter 2, verse 8. My Bible says, see to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. So there was these false teachers are coming in and just trying to trick these guys and get their attention, get their focus off of Christ. Look at verse 16. Colossians chapter 2, verse 16. Therefore let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of the things, but the substance belongs to Christ. Right? He said, don't let people get all on you about, okay, well, what about this? You need to do that. Look at verse 18. Let no one disqualify. I guess your Bible says condemn, but let no one disqualify you. What else does it say there? Can someone just read verse 18?
Don't let anyone admit you, one man condemn you by insisting on pious self-denial or the worship of angels, saying that they have had visions about this, the sinful mind is unmade in fact.
Okay, good. So here he says, let no one disqualify you, insisting on pious acts, whatever, the asceticism, the worship of angels, going on in detail about visions. And basically, again, these are all things to get people thinking, oh yeah, I need to do that. And it's that lean that we get into, right? I need to do this, I need to do that. What does Paul say? Look at what he says in verse 19. Don't let anyone do this, he says, and not holding fast to the head, from whom the whole body, nourished and knit together through its joints and ligaments, grows with a growth that is from God. Verse 20, if with Christ you died to the elemental spirits of the world, why, as if you were still alive to the world, do you submit to regulations? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. These are things saying, if you do not handle, if you do not taste, if you do not touch, you'll be qualified, you'll be okay. This is what you have to do. This is the new legalism in Colossians. And he says, verse 23, these have an appearance of wisdom in promoting self-made religion, asceticism, and severity of the body, but they're no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh. Because the moment I start to look to something else to make me right with God, I have moved away from the source. I have moved away from the head. He says to you guys, are visions bad? Are visions bad? No. They're not bad, are they? But if somehow we start getting teaching or thinking that if you're really spiritual, if you're really connected, you need to have those, you're moving away from the source, which is Christ. Is fasting bad? No. But if somehow we get a teaching that thinks that I need to do that in order to be right with God, I'm moving away from the source, which is Christ. Paul is constantly bringing them back to all of these things that we're being asked to do, told to do, encouraged to do. Is it bringing me closer to Christ, or is it making my attention now to start getting onto something else? That's the issue for Paul. It's expressed like this in Colossians. Don't let anyone disqualify you, insisting on this stuff and not holding fast to the head. Well, how is it expressed in Galatians? Turn now to Galatians chapter 5. It's the same idea. It's expressed in different terms. Galatians chapter 5. And let's start at verse 1. Okay? Galatians 5, verse 1. In their context, in Galatia, what was being put on them was, you've got to follow the law. You've got to be circumcised. You have to follow the law, right? In Colossians, it's do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. You need to have these kind of visions. You need to do this. It's all this stuff that gets piled on. That makes you right with God. And in Colossians, Paul says, don't do that because it moves you away from the head, which is Christ. Well, in Galatians chapter 5, verse 1, for freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to, my Bible says, a yoke of slavery. Then in Galatians, it was being expressed as obedience to the law, being circumcised. If you do that, you'll be okay. And then Paul, if you would, with the person next to you, read verses 2 to 4. Galatians 5, verses 2 to 4. Okay. Notice in Colossians chapter 2, Paul says, right? In Colossians 2, Paul says, if you are, people are telling you, you've got to have these visions, you've got to have this, you've got to that. He says, it moves you away from the head, Christ, who is the source, right? Well, notice what he says in Galatians 2. You are, my Bible says, I don't know what yours says in verse 4. Mine says, you are severed from Christ. Does yours say cut off or cut off? Okay, good. You are cut off from Christ. That's exactly the same idea as Colossians 2. That you're moving away from the head, the source. Here he says, you are severed from Christ. You who would be justified by the law, you have fallen away from grace. If you are going to move to a place away from, if you're going to move away from no, I have to do this in order to be made right with God. He's saying you are falling away from grace. And in Colossians, he's telling these guys, you guys, don't submit to these things. It looks good, he says in Colossians 2. It looks very spiritual. Man-made religion is what he calls it. Looks very spiritual. But you've moved away from the source. You've moved away from the head. And the thing is, you guys, is that man-made religion is very flattering to our flesh. It's very flattering to our flesh. That for a season, legalism and this kind of stuff, it actually makes us feel quite good. Because we feel more spiritual, right? We feel like that. There is a sense in which it's flattering to our flesh, but it is death-producing. If we have moved away from it's Christ and Christ alone, if we've moved away from the source, it's death-producing. And so if it's Jesus plus anything, right? I have moved or I am moving away from the source. And that's why Paul is so serious about it. And so here in Colossians, you've got these guys that are coming in and telling them, if you really want to be right with God, you got to do this, this, and this. No. It's Christ. So whatever we are being asked to do, the question is always, does it cause me to cling closer to the head? Does it cause me to cling closer to Christ? If there's books that are encouraging me to fast, okay, hey, that's wonderful. Is that encouraging me to cling closer to Christ? If there are books that are telling me to do this, or teachings that are asking me to do that, it's all good as long as it's keeping me close to Christ. That He is the source, He's the one, right? So Paul, that's this idea that we see. We see it in Galatians chapter 5. We see it here in Colossians 2. Paul says, do not fall under what he calls a yoke of slavery. Okay, let's go back to Ephesians now. And how about, let's take a quick 5-minute break, okay? Because we've been going for a while. Let's take a 5-minute stand up, go to the bathroom if you need to go to the bathroom break. We're going to move into the last half of Ephesians 4 to 6, okay? So take a quick break. 5 minutes, we'll come back.
Can you just leave this up during...
What's that?
Can you just leave this up for... I'm going to restart things. My old...
Okay, if we can make our way back to our seats, please.
Here, I need that. Actually, I probably don't need it. I'm just going to share for like 30
Go
seconds.
ahead.
I kind of want my hands,
Okay.
so I'll just be loud.
Okay, as we make our way back to our seats, Randy's going to share for a moment before we start up with Scott again.
And I think what we can just pray for each other, is that, again, just more and more that we would just have revelation of that, Because again, it's so easy to just move away from that place of just recognizing our absolute need for Jesus. We call it, unfortunately, sometimes spiritual maturity. That somehow I can become more mature, and in many people's minds, we feel like we need less grace the more mature we become. That's false, see? Because the source, Colossians chapter 2 tells us, the source is Christ. That any spiritual growth comes from Christ, see? And one of the greatest dangers is to move to this place where we have a false understanding of spiritual maturity that says that I need grace less than when I was a young Christian or a sinner or a whatever. The truth is that we need to be connected to the source as much today as we did the day we got saved, right? That's the truth. And the danger of, if I can say it this way, the danger of spiritual maturity, I know this sounds weird, but the danger of spiritual maturity sometimes is that we can get to this place of thinking we need grace less. But we don't. Because if we ever start moving away from that, we're moving away from the source, we're moving away from the head. And so whatever spiritual disciplines we have, I think spiritual disciplines are wonderful, you guys. I practice some spiritual disciplines. I think those things are good. But we always have to see them in the context of staying connected to the source, staying connected to the head. That this does not qualify me. Fasting does not qualify me. Reading my Bible does not qualify me. Doing these things does not do that. Okay? Paul he would warn us so stringently to stay away from that. All right, so chapter 4. We're back in Ephesians now, okay? Ephesians. So Paul is going to now talk about, so if all of this is true, what God has done, right? What God has done, he's going to use this metaphor of walking. If this is what God has done for us, then we need to walk a certain way. And actually 5 times in chapters 4 and 5, he's going to use this idea of walk, okay? So, chapter 4, verse 1. your Bible might say, probably says live, I'm guessing. Conduct yourselves. I don't know how it says it, but I therefore, a prisoner for the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling. Does it say walk?
Lead a life.
Lead a life. Okay, that's fine. It's actually the Greek word to walk. Okay, it's a lifestyle. Chapter 4, verse 17. Does it say lead a life? No longer lead a life like the Gentiles? Chapter 4, verse 17. Live no longer. Okay, good. Chapter 5, verse 2. What does it say there? Live a life. Okay, it's the same word walk there. What about chapter 5, verse 8?
Walk it out.
Live as people. Okay, so again, live. And then chapter 5, verse 15. What does it say there?
Careful how you live.
Live. Okay, good. Those places, all right? It's all the same word in Greek. It's this idea of walk. It's like, how do I respond now to chapters 1 through 3? And Paul's going to say this is how we respond to chapters 1 through 3. And I looked at it yesterday, or we talked about it yesterday, so I'm not going to go too much into too much detail. But chapter 4, verse 1, Paul says, I therefore, a prisoner for the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling. And we looked at this yesterday, but this idea of worthy of the calling. That word in Greek, worthy, and this again is a dominant metaphor for Paul. If you want to know what Paul would have, when Paul preaches and when he talks, if you're going to go on outreach, if you're going to go teach in another place, I would suggest using this. Use this idea. Teach from this idea. Because Paul does this in many places, okay? It's the idea of living a life worthy, and worthy means giving weight to. The actual word is axios in Greek, and it means to sort of bring into balance. To bring into balance. And so the idea for Paul is, how do I respond? What do I make chapters 1 to 3 look like? Are chapters 1 to 3 meh? Is that what chapters 1 to 3 are? Or are chapters 1 to 3 heavy? Does my life show that 1 to 3, what God has done, really means something to me? That's the idea of worthy. And it's going to be a metaphor that Paul uses in other places, okay? Let me just show you a couple examples. Colossians chapter 1, and don't know if your Bible is going to say it or not, but it's there, okay? Colossians chapter 1, verse 10. Starting at verse 9, he says, So from the day we heard, this is Colossians 1:10, or verse 9. So from the day we heard, we have not ceased to pray for you, asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of His will and all spiritual wisdom and understanding. Verse 10, so as to walk in a manner worthy of the Lord. Does it say worthy? Probably not. What does it say? Honor. Great. Honor carries the idea of weight as well, right? So just walk in a way that gives weight to God. All right, turn over the next book, 1 Thessalonians. Remember, 1 Thessalonians was written in the early 50s. Ephesians, Colossians written in the early 60s. So this is a good span of 10 years, but you see the same idea here. This became a dominant idea for Paul. 1 Thessalonians 2, let's start at verse 11. Okay, 1 Thessalonians 2, verse 11 and 12. For you know how like a father with his children, so this is when Paul was in Thessalonica, we exhorted each one of you and encouraged you and charged you to walk in a manner worthy of God, who calls you into His own kingdom and glory. So does it say worthy? Does it say honor?
Worthy.
Worthy. Okay, well there it is. All right, so that's the same word. It's used in 1 Thessalonians 2. In the early 50s, Paul never changes his message. In the early 60s, he's talking to Ephesians, he's talking to the Colossians, and he's saying, walk in a manner worthy of God. And the idea is simply show from your life that what God did for you means something to you. Give weight to it. Bring it into balance. Show that it's heavy. Show that it actually means something. And that is I think, when Paul thinks about what do I do? how do I respond? He's like, well, just live in a way that shows that that stuff we just talked about really means something. Does my life reflect that the cross is significant? Does my life reflect the cross means something to me? And, we looked at this already, right? When we talked about the wrong question, right? What's wrong with it? Well, what's wrong? I mean, that's such an immature question sometimes. Well, why can't I do this or that? And of course, I mean, I need to be careful because, you don't want to be one of those parents that, but as my kids are growing up, right? If you're a parent, you probably understand this. Anytime we want to watch a movie, and I say no, do you know what the question is that comes up every time? Well, yeah, why, of course. And what's wrong with it, right? That's always the question, right? It's like, why, Dad? What's wrong with it? That's always the question. Wrong question, right? That's the wrong question. It's not what's wrong with it. Is it, well, what's good about it? What's good about it? What's gonna benefit us in this thing? Is there anything that's going to benefit us in this thing? And for us, it's like, well, what's wrong with, we, as Christians, we can get so immature and we can get so caught up in, well, why, are you saying I can't be on my phone? Like, well, no, but the amount that you use your phone, the amount that you spend on Facebook, the amount that we spend on YouTube, because see, I love the fact that God doesn't anywhere in the Scripture say 1 hour on internet is enough. God doesn't say that. Because the more rules you get, the more immature you can be and still be a rule follower. Right? That's the reality. The more rules I get, the more immature I can be and still be a rule follower. But when it's just left up to metaphors like this, hey, live in a way that shows that God means something. Well, what does that mean? Well, you know what? It's going to mean something different for probably every person in this room. But it's the same principle. Do you guys, as a DBS, do you as a class, do we as Christians, do we live lives in such a way that says, you know what, the gospel really means something to me? It's significant, it's heavy. And of course, you guys, the answer is no. Not like we should, right? Because we're sinners and we need forgiveness. But the goal, the direction that we're headed in, is God, make me a person that shows from my life that the cross means something to me. And that, we looked at that picture, right? That if this stuff, is there anything wrong with video games? No. But you know what? If it looks like video games are more important to you than the gospel, you might want to just stop and pause for a little bit. Think about that. If it looks like these other things are more important to us. Again, if my whole life is caught up in whether or not the Oakland Raiders go to the Super Bowl, that's immature. Now, I'm a Raiders fan. Okay, I'll just tell you. I'll let you know that, okay? But I'm sorry. I am from California. But, you guys, if my whole life is just wrapped up in are they going to make it or not, I don't think that's living in a way that shows that the gospel's heavy, right? Now, I'm not saying you can't be a sports fan. And I'm not, again, that's the thing, right? We can't enjoy those things. But just Paul, the metaphor for him in Ephesians and Colossians 10 years earlier in Thessalonians, walk in a manner worthy of God. Show that he's heavy. Okay? That's a dominant theme for Paul. So I just again, I want you to kind of see that. And Romans, he'll say it a little bit different in Romans. He says, offer ourselves up, Romans 12, in view of the mercies of God, offer ourselves up as living sacrifices, which is our proper sense of worship, right? All right, so chapters 4 through 6, or chapters 4 and 5 in particular, Paul is going to talk about what does it look like to live worthy. And wow, there is so much good stuff in here that I just want to encourage you guys to continue to dig in here, just to continue to go in, because there's so much good stuff in chapters 4 through 5. We just aren't going to have the time for it today. I want to just draw attention to a couple of things. And then, like I said, I want to try and hopefully get to the family stuff here at the end, because it's important. So everything that we are going to be looking at in chapters 4 through 6, I think comes under this idea of worthy, okay? So all these toes, I mean, they're going to be different things to describe, but these are all ways that we show the gospel's heavy. So the interesting thing about that is that when Paul gets to relationships, that means that the way a husband treats his wife shows whether or not the gospel's heavy in his life. And the way a wife treats her husband shows whether or not the gospel's heavy in her life. And the way parents take care of their kids shows whether or not the gospel is heavy in their life. It's all spiritual, right? It's all spiritual. The way masters treat their slaves shows whether or not the gospel's heavy in their life. I believe that worthy, this is the dominant metaphor for Paul. And so everything that's going to follow in 4 through 6 is just basically saying, show that it's heavy, right? So the way we live in our families shows if the gospel's heavy in our life or not. There is no place for an appearance, a way we conduct ourselves in ministry, and a way I conduct myself in my family. If those two things are not going together, I am not living worthy. I'm not showing that the gospel's heavy in my life. Which, of course, is incredibly frightening. And that's, of course, why, I can look like the most spiritual guy in the world when I come and share in a school. Because you guys see me about, 3 hours in the morning. I might get to see some of you the rest of the time. But really, if you want to know how spiritual I am, man, you just come spend the night at my house, right? Hang out with my kids. You better pretty quick, you understand true spirituality at that point. That's why I don't bring them. No, just kidding. All right, so no. All right, but no, that's really, how do I live with my family, right? Okay, so anyways, back to chapter 4. First thing Paul talks about is unity. When Paul thinks about worthy in chapter 4, the first thing he talks about is unity. Now, thinking about the Ephesians, thinking about their background, why is unity important? They're self-focused, right? And they're all about their own cults, their own this. It's all about me getting a secret. It's all about that kind of stuff. And so the first thing Paul addresses is unity. And notice that he says, verse 4, there's one body, one Spirit, just as you were called to one hope that belongs to your call. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of us all, right? It's unity because they're so used to being all these different religions and mystery cults and all that. And he says, no, it's unity. Verse 7. Can someone read verse 7 for me in a nice loud voice, please?
However, he has given each one of us a spiritual gift through the generosity of Christ.
Okay, great. What I think is beautiful here is that in the early parts of chapter 4, you get both unity and diversity. That there is one faith, one baptism, one Lord, but however, he's given each of us different gifts. And so you have both unity and diversity. And if we had more time, we could really sit on this for a while. Because what that shows us is the most glorifying way to live is when we have unity in diversity. To have diversity, or to have division with diversity, does not glorify God, right? Obviously, if there's division among us, if in our teams, if in our community, there is division, that does not glorify God. Not as obvious, though, is if there is unity without diversity. That does not glorify God as much either. What truly glorifies God is unity with diversity. That is even more glorifying, right? Diversity with division, that's bad. Unity without diversity, not as awesome. Unity within diversity, or diversity within unity, or however you're supposed to say that, that's what we're going for, right? And I want to say that particularly because I know this is an Awaken DBS. And I know Awaken's all about community, right? So I'm throwing this to you guys on purpose. I think this is such a great thing there, that we have one Lord, one faith, one baptism. However, he's given each of us individual gifts. And particularly, when we look at chapter 2 tomorrow, that he's talking about Jew and Gentile. That as you guys think about community, I think you want to pray and ask and hope and work towards that your communities are not a bunch of people that just look the same. Because what glorifies God more, okay? Now, I'm not saying that, well, we're all 5 white people and, oh well, I guess we're hosed. No. But as we reach out and are intentional in reaching out to people who are different from us, so Latinos with Asians and Caucasians with whoever else, Mexicans, whoever I said it. Okay, so just whoever. Well, I already said Latinos, but anyways, all right. So if we're all there together, you guys, if we have unity in that, see, the more that makes people go, wow, how do you guys get along, right? How does that work? What's the gospel? That's how it works. So, anyways, throw that out there for you guys to think about. I think this is a beautiful picture. The first thing Paul talks about is how we have been given unity with diverse gifts, and that glorifies God. All right, then he goes on, and we're gonna skip now, you guys, through chapter 4. I want to touch on one other thing that I think shows us again a life message of Paul. Hopefully you're starting to kind of draw these strings together. Read with the person next to you, chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. All right. In Philippians, we talked about this thing called joy, right? And what was joy? Jesus, others, yourself. Okay? Then in Corinthians, we saw that when Paul wants to motivate people, okay, they're struggling with, should I eat with idols, in temples, or should I not? Paul talks about giving up your rights in chapter 9, right? Then they're struggling with spiritual gifts in 12 through 14. How do I motivate them? In chapter 9, he motivates, give up your rights. What does that look like in chapter 13 of Corinthians? Love. For Paul, those things are the same. That love is giving up your rights. It's laying down your rights for other people, right? That's what we saw in 1 Corinthians. So this was Philippians. Then we saw in 1 Corinthians, chapters 9 and 14, it's giving up your rights. That's what love is, right? Well, now we see in Ephesians 5 that what is love? Therefore, be imitators of God as beloved children. Verse 2, and walk in love as Christ loved us. And what does your Bible say? Does it say gave himself up? Offered himself? Okay, same idea. When Paul thinks about love, it's always a giving of ourselves for other people. In Philippians, it's putting others first. Look, Philippians chapter 2, let everyone look not only to his own interests, but to the interests of others. Consider others as more important than yourselves, he says in Philippians 2. 1 Corinthians 9, Paul says, I have these rights, but I give them up for the gospel and for you guys. 1 Corinthians 13, Paul says, you know what? If I have all these spiritual gifts, but I don't have love, it's nothing. And here in Ephesians 5, Paul says, walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering. Now, the reason that's important, okay, is that Paul's going to bring that then straight into the family. This idea, this verse here, verse 2, walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself for us. Where does that come up again later in chapter 5? Where does it come again later in chapter 5? Yep, in marriage, good. And specifically, it's addressed to husbands, right? Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for it. All right. Real quickly, in looking at the family stuff here in Ephesians 5. In this culture, for a wife to be told to submit to her husband was a no-brainer. Okay? And in this culture, in this time, for a wife to be told it, where it says here, wives, submit to your husbands, verse 22, as to the Lord, that was a no-brainer for them. But for Paul to say, submit to your husbands as to the Lord, what does your Bible say? In the same way, or as unto, verse 22?
As the church submits to Christ.
As to the Lord. Okay, good. Again, if we had time, you guys, in Ephesians 5, what you want to look at, where can I put this? In Ephesians 5, 22 and following, is you want to look at what we call connectives, or connectives and comparisons. Because there are going to be times in Ephesians 5 when Paul is talking to husbands and wives where he's going to say, all right, look I want you to do this just like Christ. Okay, I want you to, do this. But oftentimes what he's talking about in Ephesians 5 is he's talking about our heart. And I have my colors backwards, but that's all right. So if we have he's talking about our heart. Our motivation for doing it. When some people read verse 22, they read it, wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord, which means basically he's like God to you. That's not what Paul's saying in Ephesians 5. This as to the Lord, okay, if you look at, let's say, go to chapter 6 for a second. He's talking about your heart attitude. In the same way, in the hopefully joyful, willing way that you submit to the Lord. Let me show you where you see the same phrase in chapter 6. Let's start at verse 5. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart. So he's talking about your heart motive here, right? Everyone see that? Obey your masters with a fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ. Not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but as servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. So notice again, he's talking about your heart here. Rendering service with a good will as to the Lord. It's the exact same phrase here as it is in chapter 5 where it's talking to wives. As to the Lord and not to man. It's very clear in chapter 6 when Paul says as to the Lord, he's talking about your heart attitude. So, the radical thing for Paul here, for Paul to tell a wife, submit to your husband, tell me something I don't already know. For Paul to say, wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord, with the same joyful way that you want, that willingness that you do to the Lord, whoa, this is new. This is gospel kind of stuff now. This is not the way it used to be. This is gospel. Do this with a heart attitude that can only happen in the gospel, right? This is transformation kind of stuff. And that's why our families, are so important. They demonstrate the gospel. And it's exactly what God intends. Because look at chapter 5, verse 32. Paul quotes Genesis. In 31, he quotes Genesis. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother, hold to his wife, the two will become one flesh. Verse 32. This mystery is profound. I'm saying it refers to Christ and the church. Paul says, he tells us, the husband-wife relationship, the marriage relationship was given to show Christ and the church. That when the way I live with my wife is supposed to be preaching. The way I live with my wife is supposed to be evangelism. The way I live with my wife is supposed to show the world that God is heavy, that He's real, that He changes things. Because for a wife to be told, wives, submit to your husbands, as to again, submit to my husband, tell me something I don't already know. As to the Lord, well, wait a minute. That's different. That's gospel kind of stuff. And then, of course, as the husbands are sitting there in church, they're just kind of like, yeah, that's right. They're hearing this in church, right? That's right. Did you hear that? Submit to me. I was like, well, okay, Then Paul, so he spends 3 verses talking to wives, and then he spends 8 verses talking to husbands, right? What does that tell us? tells us husbands need a little more time, right? We just need a little bit, just need a little bit more time with this, right? And again, probably because culturally, what Paul's about to say now culturally is blow you out of the water stuff. Because in this culture, again, wives were a necessity. Wives were something that, yeah, we have wives, we're supposed to. We have kids, it's legal, right? It's good to do that. But for sex, a lot of times, you would go to prostitutes. That was something that was much more common during this time. Homosexuality abounded during this time because, again, they believed that women were not quite as spiritual as men, right? And so if I want to have this power encounter with my spiritual equal, I'll go to a man. Or oftentimes in the Roman culture, to a boy. At least a male one, right? Because that's my spiritual equal, right? So homosexuality was very rampant during this time because of this, again, this messed up view of spirituality. But for husbands, it was basically, wives were something that we kind of needed. It was a necessity. And so then Paul comes in, verse 25. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. This is radical stuff now. This, and you can tell how radical it is because Paul has to go on and spend 8 verses really unpacking that. I really mean this, guys. And he just talks, and basically the call to husbands is sacrifice yourself for your wives. We read verse 22, wives submit to your husbands, and sometimes people sort of bucket that. Oh, I don't like the way that sounds. I don't like that. Why should a wife have to submit to her husband? Well, you read verses 25 and following, if a husband is sacrificing himself for his wife, it's not going to probably be a problem. If they're both doing what they're supposed to do, right? Now, of course, the husband is not supposed to just give himself for a wife when she submits only. And the wife is not supposed to submit to her husband only if he loves her sacrificially. They both have been given their roles. But if they will do this, it will be the gospel. It will show the gospel. And so, family relationships are just as spiritual as anything else. And so, a couple days ago when I was exhorting us in hard work, and tell me your name again. It's no, not Sheree. Behind you there. Yes. Our sister. I'm sorry. My hearing's not that awesome. So, Audi. Yes. Oteil. Okay, good. All right. As she was saying, remember when she was talking about, if we're working 90 hours a week and loving it, but don't forget our families, this is it, right? Because this is how we evidence the fruit of the gospel as well. And the last thing I'll say, you guys, because I know we need to wrap up. One last thing that I think it was important for them to see here. Chapter 6, Paul says, let me just show one last thing. Verse 33, again, talking about its husbands and wives. Verse 33 of chapter 5. Let each one of you love his wife as himself. Men are just naturally selfish, so Paul appeals to that. And then the second half, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. It's the heart. He's talking about a heart issue here, right? And hearts only get changed in the gospel. That's how they get changed, right? That's how it happens. But then verses 1 through 4, last thing I want to draw attention to is it's not just a husband-wife thing, it's a family thing. Verse 4, and particularly important for us to see here, and I say this to the men, right? I want to say this to the men. Verse 4, fathers, do not provoke your children, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. It is the responsibility, in this culture back then, in our culture today, there can be this understanding that I'm the breadwinner. I go out and work, then I come back and I watch TV, right? My wife takes care of the spiritual upbringing of the kids. It's not biblical. It is on you as men. Okay, now I'm not saying it's not on the women, but it definitely is on you as men to be responsible. If you're going to be a father, if you're going to have a family, it is on you to be responsible for the spiritual upbringing of your kids. Now, it's a team thing. We see that in the rest of the scriptures. But here Paul has to address the Ephesians, telling the fathers specifically, because they had their concept of, just let the wife take care of it, or maybe even hire someone to bring up the kids. And Paul has to speak specifically to them and say, no, fathers, the way you treat your kids is also part of the gospel. It's all spiritual. So, as we finish for today, you guys, just as you'll see the same thing in Colossians. You look at Colossians 3, it says the same thing there, okay? But Paul, for all of this, Paul's major metaphor, if you catch nothing else, is that the major metaphor that dominated his view of our response is that we just live in a way that gives weight to the gospel. And really, you guys, it's a great question to just sort of take with us as we go. Because then it's not a matter of, is this right or is it wrong? Yeah. Is it half an hour or 45 minutes? Yeah. It's just a matter of, does my life give weight? Does it show that it's heavy? And Paul's prayer for them in Colossians, and my prayer for us, is that we as missionaries, as people in YWAM, that we would be able to live lives that would say the gospel means something to us, right? That it's heavy. That's it, okay? So, let me pray for us, and then we'll be done. Lord, just as Paul prayed for the Ephesians, as he prays for the Colossians, I pray for us, and I pray particularly for this class. Heard such good things about this class, Lord. I thank you for these guys, and I want to just pray, as Paul prayed, that Lord, that they would get more of a revelation of what you have done, Lord Jesus, that you would be lifted up more and more in their sight, that we would never move away from you being the head, we'd never move away from the source, that we would stay close, Lord Jesus. And I pray that, Lord, as a group of people that want to please you, God, I pray that they would hear, Lord, what you have done, that Ephesians 1 through 3 would just blow them away again, God. That we'd be impressed with what you've done. And I ask, Lord, that also just as a group of people, that then, Lord, we would be able to just show that means something, God. For each of us, it'll be different. But Lord, may we just live a life that shows that the gospel's heavy. The way we treat one another, the way we treat our families. God, may we live lives that show that the gospel is significant, Lord. That it carries weight. So God, I pray your blessing on them, Lord. And I just thank you again for time. Thank you for just getting time to be in your word. Thank you for the freedom to be in this place, Jesus. Not worried about people coming and doing weird things. Just be able just to be here, just to be in your word, God. Thank you for that. Thanks for the food we're about to eat. Thank you for just all your goodness to us. In your name, Lord. Amen.